Hi, I'm Sarah Collins, Chair of Musicology and Chair of Research at the UWA Conservatorium of Music. Take the A Train is a swing-era classic that became known as the signature tune of the jazz orchestra of the famous American band leader and composer Duke Ellington. To understand Take the A Train for your ATAR exam, you must build a picture in your minds of 1930s America. It was a time of racial segregation, where African Americans were excluded from social and educational spaces occupied by white Americans, and they suffered a huge range of other injustices that were, in many cases, enshrined in law. It was also a time of economic depression. The massive Wall Street stock market crash had occurred in 1929, and there was a global economic recession that played out across the course of the 1930s. And it was also a time of prohibition, which was a period of heavy restrictions on the sale of alcohol in the US. So racial segregation, economic depression, and prohibition. Now this is more than simply a backdrop or context to the piece. It is integral to how the music is constructed, both in instrumentation, at least on the original recording, and its form, as well, of course, in its swing rhythm. These elements are all tightly bound up with a social phenomenon that really relied on the sense of subversiveness and transgression that enabled it, namely a spirit of opposition to the prevailing social conditions that I just mentioned. The social phenomenon that I'm referring to is swing. Swing was a popular form of social dance in the 1930s and 40s, and it also named the style of jazz music played for it. It had a thriving subculture of social dancers known as jitterbugs, as well as associated record labels, magazines, clubs, and bands. Swing usually has 4 beats in a bar, as opposed to the 2-beat rhythms of pre-swing jazz. It relied a lot on riff-based choruses and call and response gestures, improvised solos over driving accompaniments, and it often had a prominent rhythmic drive appropriate to its dance music function. The original 1941 recording of Take the A Train partakes of this subculture of swing. So when you were listening to it and writing about it, it is useful to remember that the music was all about dance. Dance and dance moves, moving bodies in subterranean dance halls that used the aura of subversiveness as a way to get the audiences in. Social dance is what makes this music sound the way it does. Having said that, the musical style of swing outlived the popularity of swing dancing by decades. And indeed, later styles of music that accompanied social dancing after swing dancing, such as R&B, and other forms of jazz such as bebop, that were embraced by serious jazz connoisseurs as the new and experimental form, still owed a lot to swing. Their rhythms were still often swing rhythms. We see this too in the later 1957 recording of Take the A Train by Ella Fitzgerald, which we talk about in a related video. But first, back to Duke Ellington and the context of the song's original composition. Swing bands and jazz orchestras grew from a typical size of 10 players in the 1920s to up to 17 players in the 1940s, and they were divided into quite defined sections, including brass, trumpets and trombones in one section usually, reeds such as clarinets and saxophones in another section, and the rhythm section of double bass, guitar, piano and drums. These sections tended to move together and serve defined functions in relation to each other. The bands were often named after their figurehead band leaders such as Fletcher Henderson, Benny Moten, and of course Duke Ellington. There were still bands that played conventional dance music called sweet bands, whereas hot bands played swing. On the other side, swing was seen by some as an inauthentically commercial or lesser alternative to real jazz, namely to New Orleans jazz. Duke Ellington's band followed this instrumentation and sat at the cusp of these developments in swing as a subculture. Ellington had a massive influence on jazz history through his band's performances and recordings, through his compositions, and through the celebrity force of his personality. Unlike a number of other figures who became prominent in jazz history, Duke Ellington was not born into poverty and was not self-taught. He was born into a middle-class African-American family in Washington in 1899. He was originally named Edward Kennedy Ellington, but was nicknamed Duke during childhood, apparently due to his air of sophistication. Ellington played at social events in his late teens with his first band called the Duke's Coloured Syncopators, who then went on to play larger gigs in New York. He began recording, and with a new manager, Irving Mills, in the late 1920s, Ellington was on his way to becoming a well-known figure. From 1927 to 1931, Ellington played at the Cotton Club in Harlem, one of the numerous venues that emerged during the era of Prohibition that played what was considered to be exotic music and sold bootleg alcohol. The club had jungle pictures on its walls, and its printed flyers were often jungle-themed, picturing African American performers entertaining what was most a fairly wealthy white audience. Gradually, Ellington's audience expanded, though, further, with hits like It Don't Mean a Thing and Sophisticated Lady in the 1930s. Ellington and his band began touring internationally, and he also became well known as a composer, turning to larger works in the 1940s in his contract with Carnegie Hall to provide an extended work per season, like his 48-minute Black, Brown and Beige symphonic work. These extended works were sometimes seen as being of dubious quality, with his real talent lying in small forms, but more recently his larger works are beginning to be reassessed. Ellington had a range of music teachers in piano as well as in composition and orchestration, and from the late 1920s his works became more chromatic and complex. Although he used simple chord progressions, he relied on the minor second and major seventh and minor ninth to offer richness. He was interested in tonal colour and timbre as well, using unusual combinations of muted brass to highlight colour in songs such as Mood Indigo. Rhythmically, even within the context of swing, Ellington was more conventional, likely because social dance was the basis of his audience. Though later in his career, he sought to draw jazz beyond dance music. Ellington used onomatopoeia in several of his songs, and he had a particular interest in trains, such as in Light and Daybreak Express, Happy-Go-Lucky Local, and Track 360. On the same theme, though not using as explicit onomatopoeia as in these works, Take the A Train was actually composed by Billy Strayhorn, who became a significant collaborator for Ellington. The piece was first recorded in 1941, when Ellington was in his early 40s, so quite a way into his career. The title was said to relate to the new subway line to Harlem, linking the piece not only to where Ellington lived, but also his earlier connection with the area through the Cotton Club. The subway line to which the A Train refers was literally, as the lyrics in later vocal versions say, the quickest way to reach Harlem. Features of the piece that are characteristic of Ellington's band style include the use of contrast, such as between the saxophones carrying the smooth lyrical melody contrasted with and punctuated by the sharp, short interjections by the muted trumpets and open trombones, as we see in the first 16 bars of the piece, after the typical 4-bar piano intro played by Ellington in that original recording. The form of the piece, again in that original 1941 recording, is AABA. The first statement of the A theme features saxophones on the melody, with muted trumpets and trombones offering interjections. Then, after a short transition and modulation, there is an improvised muted trumpet solo based on the main theme, played on the original recording by Ray Nance. It became one of his most well-known solos. The B section features saxophones and open trumpet solo in conversation, and then back to saxophones reiterating the A theme with a slow thinning out of texture and diminuendo over several other repetitions of the theme. It is as if the band is walking away. The care taken with dynamics is also a feature of Ellington's band's performances, in addition to timbral contrasts. The fact that Ellington's work stretched across jazz, swing, musical theatre and symphonic work was symptomatic of a broader trend to explore more diverse applications of jazz, taken forward by Dizzy Gillespie and other jazz experimentalists of the 1940s. By the early 1950s, the swing band as a dance medium was outmoded, and Ellington's band's fortunes began to falter. Jazz was becoming a solo genre, and in any case, it was becoming prohibitively expensive to tour with large bands. After a short crisis, though, Ellington regrouped and experienced a new level of prestige in the context of jazz festivals, as well as utilising longer recording times enabled by developments in LP technology. When listening to Take the A Train, it is important to remember that this was a social dance piece. The swing jazz orchestra in Ellington's style and the music that was composed for this instrumentation was intimately bound up with its intended performance venue and the social activity that it defined. Ella Fitzgerald recorded a new arrangement of Take the A Train in 1957 in her collection Ella Fitzgerald Sings the Duke Ellington Songbook. The arrangement was by the original composer of the piece, Billy Strayhorn, a longtime collaborator of Duke Ellington. Fitzgerald's recording does include onomatopoeia, with a train whistle gesture heard in the muted trumpets after the 4-bar piano intro, interspersed with Fitzgerald's scat singing over the top. After singing the lyrics of the song in the first iteration of the main theme, she then moves to scatting for the chorus. Then there are 3 choruses of solo trumpet with Dizzy Gillespie featured on this recording. Fitzgerald then plays with the melody, switching between lyrics and scat singing, and we hear the train whistle gesture again toward the end, mimicked in Fitzgerald's vocal glissandi. Scat singing was most strongly associated, of course, with Louis Armstrong, made famous in his 1926 recording of Heebie Jeebies. But Fitzgerald was also highly influential in this vocal style of bop improvisation. She uses it to recompose the melody of Take the A Train and add in quotations from other pieces in her improvisations, repurposing them over the harmonic progression of the piece. And indeed, the harmonic progression underlying the theme in Take the A Train is quite interesting. Within the space of 8 bars, it moves from the tonic C to D major 7 with a flat 5, then to D minor 7, so from the tonic C to the supertonic D, then to the dominant, closing the phrase with the more typical dominant tonic movement. The flat 5 in the first D7 chord, namely the G sharp, functioning as an A flat in the melody, or it can also be seen not as a flat 5 but as a raised 11th, makes the chord sound like the subdominant of A melodic minor, which of course is a related key of C major. This gives the melody an interesting forward movement, which of course is driven on also by the rhythm in the accompaniment that pulses below the held notes. For more on ideas about rhythm and the subculture of swing that shaped Take the A Train, see some of our other videos on this piece.